Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Karen Vibes. How you all doing? Hope you're having an awesome Sunday evening. Yeah, just came back from out the road. Went to see a friend of mine. Carried some stuff for her, and I'm back home. And I say, you know what? I need to do my reading. I need to finish this book. So here I am. But awesome to be with you guys today. Thank you for joining me. I need to put this in the fridge. Give me a second, guys. Yeah, I had something I needed to put in the fridge. Totally forgot. Anyway, so let's get right into it. So welcome back to Karen Vibes, reading for the mature audience. And our book is Minty Alley, which we're still reading. And it's written by C.L.R. James and narrated by me, Karen Weir. Alright, so we're just going to get right into it. So grab your tea, grab your cool drink, or if you're busy doing something, not a problem, you can just listen right along. Alright, so let's get into it. So we had read, last chapter we read was chapter 23. So if you have been following my page, we are now at chapter 24. So you can always go on Karen Vibes on YouTube, KRENVIBES with an exclamation sign, and you can follow my reading. Alright, so let's get into it. Chapter 24. It was a very simple affair after all. When Haynes thought of all his longings and doubts and hesitations, he was amazed that possessing Maisie was so easy a business. Hold her and kiss her, Ben had said. So he held her and kissed her, and then, to his astonishment, did what he liked with her. He could not look her in the eye the next morning, but gradually that awkwardness wore off. Maisie was the soul of discretion. Mrs. Rose must never know, she said, and as Haynes would also have been ashamed for Mrs. Rose to know, they kept their secret. Maisie's manner scarcely changed. She told him jokes which formerly she had declined to do. They never made love except when they were about to go to bed together. The affair was not altogether what he had expected it would be, but as he wanted no more than Maisie gave, he missed nothing. Gosh, those dogs, some stray dogs keep coming in the yard. Every turn you see them. Anyway. But day by day they became better friends. Intimate conversations they had only when lying in bed together. All passion spent. And then they scarcely talked about their relationship, but about number 2 and the people who lived in it. They talked about how Mrs. Rose hated Maisie. No, sorry, made a mistake there. Let me start back over here. And they scarcely talked about their relationship, but about number 2 and the people who lived in it. How Mrs. Rose hated Maisie because she had seen Ben looking at Maisie and knew that Maisie could have taken him away with one wink. Of what a dirty dog that Ben was, and how Mrs. Rose had slept for years with her lawful husband and thought that sleeping with a man was a duty as a wife, and that was all. And then Ben had taught her differently and made her his slave for 18 years. Of what a liar Miss Atwell was. When caught fairly, she would beg to be excused and called it her imagination. And imagination. But that at heart she was a good soul. Of all the shifts of the household to live, all sorts of details, general and personal, about the whole past history of number 2. She told him how they all liked him from the first day he came because he was so polite, and how Mrs. Rose had sneered at Maisie and told her that she thought so much of herself, but that a young gentleman like Mr. Haynes would never look at her. Got that, you see? That's why they say must never say never. So Miss Rose tell Maisie that Mr. Haynes was a gentleman and he would never look at her. Well, so she lying in his bed now. And sometimes they always, old time people always, well, and a whole they always say not to swear for people because you never know what a person will do. Anyhow, let's continue. He was so polite, and how Mrs. Rose had sneered at Maisie and told her that she thought so much of herself, but that a young gentleman like Mr. Haynes would never look at her. There was a smile in her voice. Why did you take so long, Mr. Haynes? Well, you see, Maisie, I didn't know. The nurse was after you, you know, Mr. Haynes. What? Haynes nearly jumped out of the bed. Yes, you didn't know? She told Mrs. Rose one day that you were still a baby, that she had never seen such an innocent as you, and that she would like to take you away to the seaside for a month, and when you came back, you would be a man. And what did Mrs. Rose say? She said you wouldn't get angry. She said, you won't get angry, Mr. Haynes. No, not at all. Just tell me what she said. All right. She said, leave the poor darling alone, nurse. You don't see them often like that today. If I had a son like that, I would work my fingers to the bone to see him somebody in the land. And what happened? Nothing. And did you think I would have anything to do with the nurse? Not at all, Mr. Haynes. I knew you liked me. Oh, you did? Did you? How did you know? I knew. One night she told him that Mrs. Rose had pawned her last piece of jewelry that day. Heavens! I wish I could help her, said Haynes, but I have no money. Maisie, I am always hard up. But why, Mr. Haynes? You have a good job. People come here and tell us that you are a very bright young man and have a future. Maybe. Do you know what my salary is? $10 a week at least. 5. And I do more work than the boss, who draws 40. He leaves everything to me. Tell me about it, Mr. Haynes. And Mr. Haynes told her, to her rising indignation. And Mr. Haynes told her, to her rising indignation, she sat up in bed. But what are you going to do, Mr. Haynes? We all thought you were getting $10 a week at least. Miss Atwell said 15. Ella knew? Yes. Why? Because she said she didn't. The nurse tried to pump her, Mr. Haynes. Why don't you go and ask for a raise? I asked him and he said later he would consider it and let me know. How long ago was that? When I first came here. And you haven't asked since? No. If it was me, I would ask him and threaten him with a week's notice. Maisie said no more. But a few days after, when they were in bed together again and talking, she said, Mr. Haynes, listen to me. I have friends in the offices in town and was speaking to one of them. Go and tell Mr. Carrot, that you feel your salary is too small, that you think you have waited long enough and you want to hear something from him. But suppose he gets angry and sacks me. He wouldn't do that. People don't get sacked like that. I asked all my friends, how much you think Haynes is getting? And the least they say is $10. Everybody says that you are valuable to the firm, and they say you are conceited and stuck up because you are getting on so well, and Carrot can't do without you. But I know that isn't true about your being stuck up. Day after day, Maisie stuck at him. She abused Carrot with a personal animus that astonished Haynes, who could not understand why Maisie should so hate someone she had never even seen. He is an old advantage taker, and if it's not one thing, I hate people taking advantage. At last, one Sunday night, on Sunday evenings, Mrs. Rose and Miss Atwell usually went out together. With her arms around him and her lips on his, Maisie dug a promise out of him. Mr. Haynes, you were afraid to ask me, and I was only waiting. Go and tell him. She held him tight and shook him, and Haynes promised he would ask the next day. Next morning, she saw him to the road. And mind you, Mr. Haynes, be serious with that man. Don't tell him if he don't give you... Sorry, let me read this back again. Next morning, she saw him to the road. And mind you, Mr. Haynes, be serious with the man. Don't tell him if he don't give you, you will leave. But let him see that you mean business. Talk to him like the day you made the speech. He wouldn't say no. God, I wish it was me. That afternoon, as soon as he turned the corner, he could see Maisie standing by the front of number 2. She came running to meet him. Don't tell me you didn't ask him, Mr. Haynes. I asked him, said Haynes gravely. And what happened? Said Maisie apprehensively. He asked me what I thought I required, said Haynes, still gravely. And what did you and what you said? 5, I hope, Mr. Haynes. I said 5. And what he said, Mr. Haynes? Haynes put aside his gravity and held her by the arm. Said that was exactly what he was thinking, and he intended to let me have it at the end of the financial year. The liar! I should have asked him before. I saw the old sinner go pale when I looked at him. I am going to manage him in future. I'll never forget you, Maisie. Me, Mr. Haynes? You'll never forget me? You mustn't say such things. She was smiling, but she was serious. Why mustn't I say such things? Said Haynes, but he spoke mechanically. Because they aren't true. Come, let us go in. Give me the bicycle, and giving herself a vigorous kick off with the one foot, she rode on the pedal along the side of the house and turned in between the kitchen and the cistern with a grace and dexterity which were the wonder and admiration of the yard. So that's the end of chapter 23. No, that's the end of chapter 24. I'm just seeing how long 25 is. That's the end of chapter 24, guys. But chapter 25 seems to be a bit long. Alright, so let's go into chapter 25. Haynes lent Mrs. Rose $20 to be paid by 6 monthly deductions from his board and lodging. He and Maisie planned it. Somewhat to his surprise, Maisie raised no objections to his helping Mrs. Rose. She said she didn't hate Mrs. Rose that way. She wasn't going to stand any damn nonsense from her, and that was as far as it went. She didn't want to pull the old bitch down. Haynes wanted to write a letter. Maisie said, "No, go and tell her, Mr. Haynes. No need to write any letter. You are not begging for anything." So Haynes went up and spoke his piece and felt so happy after that he was glad he had taken Maisie's advice. And after that he was the master of the house. Nothing was ever done without consulting him. He made up Mrs. Rose's accounts and told her what to pay, and wrote letters to the more difficult creditors, endorsed a note for her. The business simply would not go well, and, as Mrs. Rose told him one day, was of far more help to her than Ben had ever been in his life. About Maisie's intimacy with Haynes, she appeared not to know, and even if she did know, as Maisie was always saying, it was his own business, but he made arrangements and met Maisie elsewhere. One morning, Mrs. Rose brought Haynes a letter she had received from her admirer, a formal proposal asking her to live with him. This admirer, who had materialized at last, was a retired police sergeant and a man of some reputation. The wife of the Inspector General, the Colonial Secretary, the governor's aide, and some others formed a very fast set and used to rush away for one-day parties to a little island off the main coast. There had been very nearly some drowning once, and ever afterwards the inspector had sent Parks on the launch with a personal request to keep an eye on them. Parks was discreet until he left the service. Only then did he speak and being no man of letters, but a good Christian, his references were to Sodom and Gomorrah instead of Bacchaio and Rabelais. There was no doubt that Parks was a proper man. He wrote that he had always loved Mrs. Rose. So here are now people. So where Tori come to bomb. So now Mrs. Rose has a new admirer. So Ben not in the picture anymore, well, from long time. Since he married the nurse. So now Mrs. Rose has a new admirer. Somebody who's taking an interest in her. So let's read on. There was no doubt that Parks was a proper man. He wrote that he had always loved Mrs. Rose, but couldn't address her as she had somebody already. But now the way was clear. He sent to assure her of his love and to say that he would always cherish her. Wow. Then came a most convincing piece. He had heard the house was mortgaged. He had some money saved and would pay off the mortgage if Mrs. Rose would put the house on his name and hers. His pension was $45 a month, and together they would be able to live like Isaac and Rebecca to a green old age. He promised to treat her kindly, and she could be sure he would never do her what the venomous reptile had done her. It was an honest and sincere letter, It had come by first post, and Mrs. Rose, being busy and not knowing the handwriting, had asked one of the boarders at had asked one of the boarders and Mrs. Hart, who had happened to be in the kitchen, to read it for her, so that everybody heard, and laughed at it before Mrs. Rose brought it to Haynes. When she came to Haynes' step, work was suspended, and they all stood round in the yard while he read. "And what are you going to do, Mrs. Rose? Accept him?" For some reason or other, to judge by its effect, this question was thought extremely funny, and Phyllis, but here Mr. Haynes, contained not only amusement but surprise. Mr. Haynes said that Mrs. Rose, "Mr. Haynes," said Mrs. Rose, "he don't want to cherish me as he put there. He have 6 children, and I them he want me to mind. That is what he want." The group became aware of Maisie almost in hysterics on the little bench. "But what's wrong with you, Maisie?" asked Miss Hart. The laughter, which Maisie had been trying in vain to suppress, overflowed, and she wandered across the yard, her head thrown back, her hands on her hips, laughing so that she could be heard at the end of the alley. Mosquitoes. "But what's wrong with her?" Mrs. Rose's face hardened. "She's laughing at me because somebody write me a love letter." And Maisie's extra loud cackle proved that Mrs. Rose was right. "She think that an old woman like me, I's a joke for her to get a letter. I's a joke. It's a joke for me to get a letter. I tell you, I wouldn't want any letter from those nasty little good-for-nothings I see you talking to by the gate every night." Mrs. Rose went back into the kitchen, swearing that she wasn't going to stand Maisie much longer. For the next day or two, there was a lot of talk about the offer. Mrs. Atwell said if it was she, he did ask. Miss Atwell said if it was she, he did ask, she wasn't going to let him pass. She had seen him in the street, and he looked a steady, respectable man with a person like Mrs. Rose, and with Mrs. Rose nice and talking ways. They were sure to get on well. Another thing was that he wouldn't prove the venomous reptile that the other had done. She had asked Haynes what he thought of it. Haynes said that he could not express his opinion. Mr. Parks was coming for his answer on Friday morning, and what Mrs. Rose intended, Haynes did not know. She said nothing to anybody. Once or twice in the yard, her eyes and his happened to meet, and she gave him a self-conscious smile and a blush. That was all. But she was brighter than usual that week. Her temper was better, and the general opinion, doubtful at first, veered round to the view that she would take Parks. On the Friday morning, she was up early and dressed herself better than she had done for a long time. Haynes thought that she was preparing for Parks, for whom things seemed to be moving well. She looked quite fresh, and there was a brightness in her face. Parks was serious, as his offer to pay off the mortgage showed, and Haynes could not believe that barefaced as Ben was, he would have the courage to fight a case in court, especially as by some lucky chance. For the 8 years that they had owned the house, The duty of paying the taxes and the rates had always fallen to Mrs. Rose, and all receipts were made in her name. Late one night she had slipped into Haynes' room and they had talked the matter over. She couldn't decide. Haynes asked her if she still cared for Ben. She repudiated the idea. "Well, I don't see why you shouldn't take him, Mrs. Rose," said Haynes. "I am glad to hear you say that, Mr. Haynes," said Mrs. Rose. "I felt that I should, but I wanted to hear what you had to say first." He was rather doubtful now that his opinion had turned the scale. "But suppose it doesn't turn out well, Mrs. Rose?" "I wouldn't blame you, Mr. Haynes," said Mrs. Rose. "I know that whatever you advise me, you are thinking of my interest." Mrs. Rose had a surprise in store for number 2, for even before Haynes left for work, she said she had business to do and went off to town. When Haynes came back to lunch, she had not yet returned. He surmised that she was evading the issue and was pondering on the eternal I don't know who used a pen ink and rub here. I don't know what that somebody used a pen ink and rubbed out this word. Anyway, he surmised that she was evading the issue and was pondering on the eternal. I don't know what that was. Somebody used a pen and rubbed this. I can't make it up. That sleeps in all women when Maisie startled him by jumping into the room in a state of high excitement. "Mr. Haynes, Mr. Haynes, Mr. Haynes! He came, he came." Who came?" Sergeant Parks. Sergeant Parks came." "Yes, and I fixed him up. When I see Mrs. Rose leave here this morning, I was only hoping she wouldn't come back in time." "What have you done now, Maisie?" Haynes asked in some alarm, for Maisie was as reckless as a runaway horse, and had made it known that she was against Mrs. Rose having anything to do with Parks. She said she didn't want any old man in the house, and having made it her business to see Parks leave on his whiskers, which she said would turn her stomach every morning she got up and saw them. "What have you done, Maisie? What have you done?" Haynes asked her again. "Come, speak up. What have you done?" He was frightened. Maisie was laughing, but she was frightened too. "I chased him away." Oh, what a naughty girl. Why she would have do it? So this girl Maisie not easy. Wonder why she chased with the man like that, man. "I chased him away." "Who?" "Mr. Parks." "Who?" "Mr. Parks, of course. Mr. Parks. If he have the face to come back again. Boy, oh boy. This is the end for you." Haynes was in a state of absolute shock, for he realized what would be the probable consequences of Maisie's escapade. But the elation of action was still with Maisie. "Let me tell you, Mr. Haynes," she said. About 9 o'clock, Mr. Parks came. He dressed up in a tweed suit and waistcoat. So I carried him inside and asked him to sit down. Mrs. Rose tell me if anybody come to say she gone to town and she will be busy the whole day, but will be here after supper. But I ain't tell him so. I say, 'You are Mr. Parks? Come in.' I knew Mrs. Rose wasn't coming back early, so I told him, 'Come and sit down, sir.' I give him a nice sir, to fool him off. Mrs. Rose will be here Mrs. Rose will be here just now. She's having a bath. Mister, sit down, and I go in the bedroom peeping at him. He only fixing his tie and smoothing down the whiskers. I say to myself, boy, if you ever come to sleep in this house, if you ever come to sleep in this house and I don't clip off those tiger cat things you have there, I don't know, such a calling the man beard tiger cat whiskers. So Mr. there, 9:15, I told him, Mrs. Rose coming just now. She taking a little time to dress herself nice, sir. I tell him so and he laughed. He must be said to himself, good things to come. The old fool, as if a lady will dress herself in a bathroom and anybody would bother to dress for an old ape like him. My God. 9:30, he began to fidget. He called me. He said, young lady, Mrs. Rose is staying long. I tell him, sir, a neighbor down the lane sent to call her urgent. She coming now. But he gets suspicious. I only praying to God now that Mrs. Rose don't come by accident, for I have some more waiting for him. Then the mister get up. Vexed now, he said. But this is all nonsense. This is not the way to treat. I tell him, excuse me, sir, but you seem dull of comprehension. He say, what? I tell him, can't you see your presence here is not requested? Why did Maisie go and do a thing like this, man? He jumped up. He say again, what? And he went into the kitchen. He went out to Archer. Archer in the kitchen, but Archer will do anything I tell him, and I have Archer ready for him. So he said, boy, where is Mrs. Rose? Archer tell him in his big voice, who you calling boy? He said, excuse me, but where is Mrs. Rose? Archer said, don't ask me anything. And Mr. take up his hat and he stamp off. My God, Maisie, cried Haynes. Mrs. Rose is going to murder you. I don't care. I don't care a damn, she said. I don't want any old man with whiskers in this house. Where is Mrs. Rose? I don't know. I suppose she coming just now. Haynes pondered for a second. You must leave this room, Maisie. I don't want Mrs. Rose to come here and catch us talking. This is the end of you. And we leave it right there. Now tell me, people, if Maisie not a terrible young lady. Look what she gonna do to the gentleman who is interested in Mrs. Rose. What a naughty young lady. Boy, oh boy. Anyway, we're stopping right there. So we started reading chapter 25, and we're going to stop in the middle of it, and we'll pick up from there when we come back on. All right, so thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm waiting on you guys to like, subscribe, and share. Send me a comment about the book that I'm reading and what you think about what I've read so far. I'm waiting to hear from you. I'm a very patient person, so I am waiting. Alright, so please like, subscribe, and share, and join me again. I'll be back on sometime this week coming. Today's Sunday, so I'll be back on probably Tuesday or so. We're actually going down to the end of the book, so I want to finish off this book because I have another interesting book that I want to read. So I want to finish off this book, and we're nearly at the end anyway. Alright, so you guys have a blessed week ahead. May all your dreams come true and your plans come true, and all the money and the goodness that you want, you will get it. All right, just work towards it. Pray and you'll get what you want. As long as you put in the work, as long as you put in the work, it will pay off. All right, so you guys have a blessed week. Have an awesome Sunday evening, and I will catch you again. Bye. And remember to join me before I go. So my YouTube page is Karen Vibes. That's KarenVibes. And that's with an exclamation sign. So you can go on my page and you can follow my reading from there. All right, so have a good week. Bye. Be blessed.